I thought I knew the man I married until I discovered he'd been hiding a $23 million lottery win from me for 8 months, while his mother had already spent half of it on a mansion in Florida that I'd never even heard of. Standing in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, clutching a crumpled bank statement I'd found hidden behind his toolbox in the garage, I realized that my husband of 14 years wasn't just a liar. He was a stranger who had systematically erased me from the biggest moment of our lives while his family celebrated in luxury I never knew existed. The numbers on that statement told a story I couldn't comprehend. Deposits, withdrawals, transfers to accounts I'd never seen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. $11.7 million already gone, and not a single penny had touched our joint account where I still deposited my teacher's salary every 2 weeks like the faithful wife I'd always been. Marcus had won the lottery, and somehow, I had lost everything without even knowing the game had started. The morning that changed everything started exactly like the other 3,612 mornings of my marriage to Marcus. I woke at 5:30 to the sound of rain pattering against our bedroom window, slipped quietly out of bed so I wouldn't disturb him, and padded to the kitchen in my worn slippers to start the coffee. Marcus had always been a heavy sleeper, especially after his night shifts at the automotive plant, and I'd learned years ago that mornings were my sanctuary. Those quiet hours before the world woke up belonged entirely to me. Our small ranch house in Millbrook felt especially cozy on rainy mornings like this. I'd bought cheerful yellow curtains for the kitchen windows 3 years ago, over Marcus's protests that they were too bright, and watching the early morning light filter through them never failed to lift my spirits. At 38, I'd grown to appreciate these simple pleasures more than I ever had in my 20s when I was constantly waiting for life to begin. Now I understood that life was happening all around me in these ordinary moments, in the ritual of grinding coffee beans and checking my lesson plans for the day. I taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary, the same school I'd attended as a child. Most people might find that limiting, never moving beyond the borders of their hometown, but I found comfort in the continuity. I knew every street, every family, every story that wove through our community. My students were often the children of people I'd grown up with, and there was something beautiful about being part of that generational thread, watching kids grow and learn in the same classrooms where their parents had once sat. Marcus and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm over the years. He worked the night shift at Henderson Automotive, manufacturing parts for trucks and heavy equipment. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well enough for us to manage our mortgage, car payments, and modest lifestyle. We'd never been wealthy, but we'd never been desperate either. We existed in that middle space where most Americans live, where you can cover your bills but a major emergency would require careful planning and maybe a loan from family. That Tuesday morning, as I reviewed my lesson plan for teaching long division, I felt grateful for our predictable life. My students were making progress, Marcus had been talking about maybe getting promoted to floor supervisor, and we'd even started discussing the possibility of finally taking that vacation to the Grand Canyon we'd been postponing for 6 years. Nothing exciting, but nothing worrying either. Just the steady march of days that makes up a marriage, a career, a life. I was reaching for my favorite mug when I noticed the garage door was slightly ajar. Marcus was meticulous about home security, always double-checking locks and making sure everything was sealed up tight before bed. Leaving the garage door open, even a crack, was completely unlike him. My first thought was that someone might have tried to break in during the night, though nothing seemed disturbed in the house. Grabbing the flashlight from our junk drawer, I slipped on Marcus's work jacket and stepped into the garage. The familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust greeted me, along with the ordered chaos of Marcus's workspace. He'd built sturdy shelving along one wall where he kept his tools organized with the precision of a man who worked with his hands for a living. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. The garage door had blown open because Marcus hadn't engaged the automatic lock properly, probably rushing when he came home from his shift at 6 that morning. As I bent to examine the mechanism, my flashlight beam caught something white wedged behind his large red toolbox. A piece of paper, folded and slightly yellowed, as if it had been there for a while. Curiosity got the better of me. Marcus and I had always been open about our finances, sharing one checking account, one savings account, making decisions together about any purchase over $50. We'd never had enough money for secrets, and we'd never felt the need for them anyway. If this was some old receipt or warranty information, it wouldn't matter. If it was something else, well, I'd ask him about it when he woke up. I pulled the paper free and unfolded it under the garage light. At first, the numbers didn't make sense to my sleep-addled brain. I was looking at a bank statement, but not from our usual bank. This was from First National Downtown, an institution I'd driven past 1,000 times but never entered. The account holder was listed as Marcus James Coleman, my husband's full legal name, but I'd never seen this account before. The balance made me sit down hard on Marcus's workbench stool. $11,734,218.67. I read the number 3 times, certain I was misunderstanding something. The account had been opened 8 months ago with an initial deposit that made my hands shake as I held the paper. $23,400,000. A single deposit, larger than any number I'd ever seen outside of movies or news reports about tech billionaires. My mind raced through possibilities. Had Marcus inherited money from some distant relative? Had there been some kind of accident settlement I didn't know about? But even as I considered these options, they felt wrong. Marcus came from a working-class family just like mine. His parents lived in a trailer park outside of town, surviving on Social Security and his father's small pension from the railroad. There were no wealthy relatives, no mysterious benefactors, no reason for this kind of money to suddenly appear in our lives. The transaction history told a story that made my stomach turn. Regular transfers out of the account, some to places I recognized and others to accounts I'd never heard of. Payments to luxury car dealerships, high-end furniture stores, travel agencies. A $40,000 transfer to something called Ocean View Properties in Clearwater, Florida. Monthly payments of $3,500 to Sunrise Assisted Living, also in Florida. None of this made any sense in the context of the life I thought we were living. I sat in that garage for nearly an hour, studying every line of that bank statement as the rain continued to drum against the roof. The dates painted a clear picture. This money had appeared in Marcus's account 8 months ago, right around the time I remembered him acting strangely for a few weeks. He'd been distracted, taking more phone calls than usual, disappearing to run errands that seemed to take longer than they should have. I'd attributed it to stress at work, maybe some family drama he didn't want to burden me with. Now I realized those mysterious errands might have been trips to a bank where he was managing a fortune I didn't even know existed. Those phone calls might have been conversations about investments, purchases, decisions that affected both of our lives but somehow excluded me entirely. The man I'd shared a bed with for 14 years had been living a completely different reality, one where we were millionaires but only he was allowed to know it. The worst part wasn't even the secrecy, though that cut deep. It was the timeline. 8 months of normal mornings, normal conversations, normal worries about money. 8 months of me buying generic groceries to stretch our budget while he had access to $23 million. 8 months of me postponing a visit to the dentist, because the copay felt too expensive while he was apparently funding some kind of lifestyle in Florida that I knew nothing about. I thought about all the times I'd felt guilty spending $40 on new teaching supplies for my classroom, how I'd agonized over whether we could afford to replace our aging washing machine, the way I'd been secretly putting aside $5 here and $10 there to save up for a surprise weekend getaway for our anniversary. Meanwhile, Marcus had enough money to buy a house in every state and still have change left over. My hands were trembling as I folded the bank statement and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Part of me wanted to march upstairs right then and demand an explanation, but a larger part of me knew I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I confronted him. This felt bigger than just a hidden bank account. This felt like my entire marriage might be built on foundations I'd never seen or understood. The rain had stopped by the time I went back inside, and I could hear Marcus stirring upstairs. His alarm would go off in 30 minutes, and then he'd lumber down to the kitchen expecting his usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, expecting the same routine we'd maintained for years.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel,
It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Except now I knew the routine was a lie, or at least incomplete in ways that changed everything. I started the eggs automatically, my hands going through the familiar motions while my mind raced. Should I act normal until I learned more? Should I confront him immediately? Should I call someone, though I couldn't imagine who? My sister lived 3 states away and had never liked Marcus anyway. My parents had been gone for 5 years, and I'd never been the type to have a large circle of confidants. My life had always been small, contained, manageable. This secret felt too large for any container I knew how to build. Marcus appeared in the kitchen exactly on schedule, his dark hair sticking up in the back the way it always did when he first woke up. At 42 he was still handsome in a rugged, working man way, though the years had added lines around his eyes and a slight paunch around his middle. He kissed my cheek absently and poured himself coffee, the same routine we'd followed for so long it had become choreographed. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, settling into his chair at our small kitchen table. "How'd you sleep?" The same words, the same tone, the same casual affection that had always felt genuine and now felt like performance. I studied his face as he read something on his phone, looking for signs of deception, for clues that he was living a double life, but he looked exactly the same as always. Tired from his shift, grateful for breakfast, already thinking about the day ahead. "Fine," I replied, setting his plate in front of him. The garage door was open when I got up. "Did you forget to lock it when you came in?" He looked up from his phone, and for just a moment, something flickered across his features. Concern? Fear? It was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Yeah, I was beat when I got home. Thanks for checking on it." The response was casual, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine, and his hand moved instinctively to his pocket where I noticed he always kept his phone. Marcus had never been particularly good at lying. During our early dating years, I could always tell when he was trying to surprise me with something because he'd get this slightly guilty look, like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I'd found it endearing then, this transparency that made me feel like I could always trust him completely. Now I realized that either he'd gotten much better at deception over the years, or I'd gotten much worse at paying attention. I watched him eat breakfast, noting details I'd normally overlooked. His clothes were nicer lately, not dramatically different, but his jeans looked newer, his work boots were clearly expensive, and he'd been wearing cologne more frequently. Small changes that individually meant nothing but together suggested someone who was spending more money on himself than our budget should have allowed. His phone buzzed constantly throughout breakfast, which wasn't entirely unusual since his supervisor sometimes needed to reach him about scheduling changes. But today I noticed he was quick to turn the phone face down after reading each message, and twice he got up to take calls in the other room, claiming they were work-related. Before today, I would have accepted these explanations without question. Now I wondered what conversations were so private they couldn't happen in front of me. After Marcus left for his morning errands, telling me he needed to stop by the bank and the auto parts store, I stood at our kitchen window watching his truck disappear down our street. The bank, of course he needed to go to the bank. Probably not our regular branch where I knew all the tellers by name, but the downtown location where he apparently kept secrets worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. I called in sick to work, something I'd done maybe 5 times in my entire teaching career. My principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was understanding as always, telling me to take care of myself and not worry about the substitute plans. If only she knew that what I was really sick with was the realization that my marriage might be a complete fabrication. With the day stretching ahead of me, I decided to investigate. If Marcus could keep secrets, maybe I could uncover them. I started with our home office, a converted bedroom where we kept our computer, file cabinets, and the various paperwork that accumulates over 14 years of shared life. I'd always handled most of our bookkeeping and bill paying, so I knew where everything was supposed to be. Now I was looking for what wasn't supposed to be there, or what was supposed to be there but wasn't. The first thing I noticed was how clean Marcus's side of the desk was. Usually he left receipts, business cards, random notes scattered around, but recently everything had been meticulously organized, or completely cleared away. The second thing I noticed was that several file folders I remembered seeing were missing. Our tax records for the current year, which I'd need soon for filing. Insurance documents that I'd specifically asked him to organize. A folder labeled Future Plans where we'd kept information about potential home improvements and vacation ideas. In the bottom drawer of his file cabinet, hidden behind old warranty information and instruction manuals, I found evidence that my husband had been busy. Phone bills for a cell phone number I didn't recognize, credit card statements from accounts I'd never heard of, showing purchases at stores I couldn't identify in cities I'd never visited. Restaurant charges in Tampa, Orlando, Miami. Hotel bills in places where we'd never taken vacations. The amounts were staggering. Single dinners that cost more than I typically spent on groceries for a week. Hotel suites that ran $300 a night. Shopping sprees at stores I'd only heard of in movies about rich people. And all of this was happening while I was clipping coupons and buying my work clothes at discount stores, believing we were living paycheck to paycheck like always. But it was the correspondence that truly broke my heart. Letters from travel agencies, confirming bookings for trips I'd never taken. Thank you notes from charities acknowledging donations in amounts that represented months of my teaching salary. And worst of all, a folder full of real estate documents for a property in Clearwater, Florida, that had apparently been purchased 6 months ago for $850,000. The house was beautiful, at least in the photographs included with the paperwork. A sprawling ranch-style home with a pool, a 3-car garage, and an address on something called Millionaire's Row. The deed listed 2 names as owners, Marcus James Coleman and Dorothy Mae Coleman. Marcus and his mother. Not Marcus and me. Not the couple who had supposedly built a life together for 14 years. Marcus and the woman who had always made it clear she thought her son could have done better than marrying a small-town teacher. Dorothy had never liked me, not from the moment Marcus brought me home to meet his parents during our 2nd year of dating. She was polite enough in front of Marcus, but when we were alone, she had ways of making her disappointment clear. Comments about how she'd always hoped Marcus would find someone with more ambition, more sophistication, more something that I apparently lacked. Over the years, I'd learned to minimize our interactions, staying cordial but distant, never giving her ammunition to use against me with her son. Now I understood why she'd been so much friendlier lately during our brief phone conversations. Why she'd stopped making those little digs about my career, my appearance, my suitability as a wife, for her precious only child. She'd gotten what she wanted, Marcus all to herself, funded by a fortune I'd been excluded from, living in luxury while I remained trapped in ignorance in our small house in Nowhere, Ohio. The timeline was becoming clearer as I pieced together the various documents. The lottery win had happened 8 months ago, based on the bank statement. The house purchase had occurred 6 months ago. The regular transfers to Sunrise Assisted Living had started 5 months ago, suggesting that Dorothy had moved into some kind of expensive senior community in Florida. All of this had been planned and executed while I was teaching fractions to 4th graders and saving grocery store coupons, believing my husband when he said money was tight and we needed to be careful with our spending. I found myself wondering if Marcus had ever intended to tell me. Had he been planning some grand revelation where he surprised me with our new wealth? Or was this always meant to be a permanent secret, a parallel life he lived without me? The evidence suggested the latter, especially given that his mother was involved from the beginning, and I'd been systematically excluded from every major decision and benefit. The phone rang while I was sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of my husband's deception. For a wild moment, I thought it might be Marcus, somehow knowing I'd discovered his secret, ready to explain everything. Instead, it was my sister Jenny calling from Oregon, her voice bright with the cheerfulness I'd always envied. "Hey stranger," she said, "just calling to check in. Haven't heard from you in weeks. How's life in small-town paradise?" Jenny had moved to Portland after college and never looked back, building a career in marketing and a life full of adventures that made my existence seem mundane by comparison. She'd married a fellow advertising executive, and together they traveled, dined at interesting restaurants, attended cultural events, and generally lived the kind of sophisticated life our mother had always encouraged us to want. "It's been interesting lately," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Marcus has been working a lot of overtime." "Really? That's great. Maybe you two can finally take that trip to Europe you've been talking about forever." She paused, and I could hear her typing in the background, probably multitasking as always. "Actually, that's part of why I called. Derek and I are planning a wine tasting tour of Italy this fall, and I thought maybe you and Marcus would like to join us. My treat, since I know things have been tight for you guys. Jenny's casual offer of charity stung more than usual, given what I'd learned that morning. Here was my successful sister offering to pay for a vacation I couldn't afford, while my husband was secretly sitting on enough money to buy the entire wine region if he wanted to. The absurdity of it made me laugh, though it came out more like a sob. That's really sweet, Jenny, but I think we'll be too busy for travel this year. I don't know, Kate, you sound different, stressed. Is everything okay with you and Marcus? My sister had always been perceptive, able to read my moods even over the phone from 2,000 miles away. Now her concern made me want to tell her everything, to pour out the whole incredible story and let her help me figure out what to do next. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, not wanting to admit that my marriage wasn't what I'd always claimed it was. Maybe it was uncertainty, not knowing yet how this story would end, or what role I was meant to play in it. Or maybe it was a deeper instinct, a recognition that this situation was too complex and potentially dangerous to share until I understood it better myself. Everything's fine, I said, forcing brightness into my voice. Just tired from the school year, you know how it is. We should definitely talk soon though. I miss you. We talked for a few more minutes about her work, her marriage, her plans for the summer. Normal sister conversation that felt surreal given the evidence of betrayal scattered around me on the floor. After we hung up, I sat in silence, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. By early afternoon, I'd created a timeline of deception that spanned 8 months and involved financial transactions I could barely comprehend. Marcus had won $23 million in the state lottery, claimed the prize without telling me, hidden the money in secret accounts, and used it to create an entirely separate life that revolved around his mother and excluded his wife completely. He'd bought her an expensive house in Florida, moved her into a luxury senior community, and apparently established himself as some kind of wealthy benefactor while I continued living like we were struggling to pay our bills. The cruelest part was how normal he'd remained at home. The same jokes, the same complaints about work, the same small affections and routines that had always defined our marriage. He'd perfected the art of compartmentalizing, of living completely different lives that never intersected. I wondered how many other wives had sat where I was sitting, surrounded by evidence that the person they'd trusted most in the world was a stranger. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Running errands taking longer than expected. Don't wait up for dinner if I'm not back by 6. Love you. Even his messages were lies now. Errands like visiting his secret bank accounts, his secret properties, his secret life, that had nothing to do with the woman who'd promised to share everything with him 14 years ago. I spent the rest of the afternoon systematically photographing every document I'd found, creating a digital record of Marcus's deception. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with this evidence, but some instinct told me I'd need it later. Then I carefully returned everything to where I'd found it, making sure the house looked exactly as it had that morning, when I'd been a naive wife who trusted her husband completely. By the time Marcus came home that evening, I'd managed to compose myself enough to go through our usual routine. I'd even managed to start dinner, though the pot roast probably tasted like cardboard since I could barely focus on cooking. He seemed tired but normal, kissing me hello and asking about my day while settling into his chair to read the local paper. "How was your day off?" he asked, looking up from the sports section. Feeling better, the casual concern in his voice might have touched me yesterday. Today it felt like mockery, like he was playing a character in a play I didn't know I was part of. "Much better," I replied, setting his plate in front of him. "Sometimes you just need a day to recharge." "How were your errands?" Same question I might have asked on any other day, but now I was listening for tells, for clues about where he'd really been and what he'd really been doing. "Fine, boring stuff. Bank, auto parts, grabbed lunch while I was out." He cut into his pot roast without looking up, the picture of a working man grateful for a home-cooked meal after a long day. "You know how it is." I did know how it was, or at least I thought I had. Now I realized I didn't know anything about how it was for Marcus, about what his days actually contained, or what he thought about when he was away from me. We ate dinner in companionable silence, the same comfortable quiet that had characterized thousands of meals over the years. But tonight it felt different to me, charged with secrets and lies that hung in the air between us. I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of guilt or deception, trying to reconcile this familiar man with the stranger who'd hidden a lottery fortune from his wife for 8 months. After dinner, Marcus settled into his recliner to watch television while I cleaned the kitchen. This too was routine, our established division of labor that had never bothered me before. Tonight, as I washed dishes by hand, because our dishwasher had been broken for 3 months and we supposedly couldn't afford to fix it, I felt a rage building that I'd never experienced before. Not just anger at the lies, but fury at the systematic way he'd diminished my life while expanding his own. I'd been living in artificial scarcity while he managed abundance. I'd been denying myself small pleasures and necessary purchases, while he funded what appeared to be an entirely separate household in Florida. I'd been the careful, responsible wife, managing our modest budget and making sacrifices for our shared future, while he'd been playing some elaborate game where the rules applied only to me. The worst part was how I'd been complicit in my own deception. Every time I'd chosen the generic brand at the grocery store, every time I'd postponed buying something I needed, every time I'd felt guilty about spending money on myself, I'd been reinforcing the fiction that we were struggling financially. Marcus had let me live that lie, had encouraged it, had benefited from it while secretly living like a millionaire. As I dried the last plate, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront Marcus yet, not until I understood the full scope of what he'd been doing and what it meant for our marriage. But I also wouldn't continue living in ignorance. If my husband could keep secrets, then so could I. If he could investigate and plan and execute complex financial strategies without involving me, then I could do the same. That night, lying in bed beside Marcus while he slept peacefully, I stared at the ceiling and planned my next moves. I would learn everything there was to know about our real financial situation. I would figure out why he'd kept this secret and what he planned to do with the money he'd already spent. I would discover whether this marriage was salvageable, or whether 14 years of what I'd thought was partnership had actually been performance. Most importantly, I would make sure that whatever happened next, I wouldn't be the naive, trusting wife who could be so easily deceived and dismissed. Marcus had underestimated me, had assumed I'd never look behind his carefully constructed facade of normalcy. He was about to learn that the small-town teacher he'd married was capable of much more than he'd ever imagined. The woman who'd discovered his secret that morning was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and significantly more dangerous than Marcus had bargained for. He'd played a game with rules I'd never been told existed. Now I was going to learn those rules and play to win. As sleep finally came, my last conscious thought was about the bank statement hidden in my purse. Tomorrow I would start building a case, gathering evidence, and preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether my marriage was worth saving or whether it was time to claim my share of the fortune my husband had tried to steal from me. The game had begun, and Marcus had no idea his wife was now a player. The next morning brought clarity that cut through my lingering disbelief like a blade. I woke before my alarm, already dressed and ready to begin what would become the most important investigation of my life. Marcus had left for his shift at 3 in the morning, kissing my forehead in the darkness, the same way he had for years, never knowing that his sleeping wife was now wide awake in ways that would terrify him. I drove to the downtown branch of First National Bank when they opened at 9, wearing my most professional outfit and carrying a folder of documents I'd prepared. The lobby was all marble and mahogany, designed to intimidate people like me who usually banked at the neighborhood branch with its folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. Today I walked through those intimidating spaces with purpose, approaching the customer service desk with the confidence of someone who belonged there. I need to speak with someone about my husband's accounts, I told the receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 50s, who looked like she'd been handling wealthy clients' problems for decades. Marcus Coleman, he mentioned there might be some discrepancies I should be aware of as his spouse. The lie came easily, and I realized that deception was apparently a skill I could develop when necessary. The banker who met with me, Robert Chen, was younger than I'd expected but carried himself with the careful professionalism of someone who dealt with serious money daily. He led me to a private office with windows overlooking the city square, offering coffee I accepted to buy myself thinking time. When he pulled up Marcus's accounts on his computer screen, his expression shifted to something approaching reverence. Your husband has been one of our most valued clients since opening his accounts with us, he said carefully. I'm not sure what discrepancies you're referring to, but everything appears to be in perfect order from our perspective. He gestured toward his monitor, which I couldn't see from where I sat. Perhaps you could be more specific about your concerns. I leaned forward slightly, projecting the worried confusion of a wife trying to understand complicated financial matters. Marcus has been handling everything himself, but I've noticed some unusual activity, and I'm concerned someone might be taking advantage of him. Large withdrawals, transfers to accounts I don't recognize. He's always been trusting, maybe too trusting. I hoped I was striking the right balance between concern and ignorance, giving him room to either help me or dismiss me as an overprotective spouse. Robert's expression grew more cautious. I understand your concerns, Mrs. Coleman, but I'm limited in what I can share without your husband's explicit permission or proper documentation showing you have authority over these accounts. What I can tell you is that all transactions have been initiated by Mr. Coleman personally, with proper identification and security protocols. There's no indication of fraud or coercion. The careful way he spoke told me everything I needed to know. Marcus had structured these accounts to exclude me completely, probably claiming he was protecting our assets from some imagined threat. The money was there, it was substantial, and it was entirely under his control. I was legally married to a millionaire, but had no more access to those funds than a complete stranger would. I understand, I said, gathering my purse and standing to leave. Perhaps I was worrying over nothing. Marcus has always been so responsible with money. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. Robert walked me to the lobby, his manner cordial but distant now that he'd established I had no legitimate claim on the information I sought. As I drove away from the bank, I felt a mixture of frustration and satisfaction. The frustration was obvious, but the satisfaction came from confirming that my worst suspicions were correct. Marcus hadn't just hidden the lottery win from me temporarily, he'd constructed an entire financial fortress designed to keep me out permanently. This wasn't an oversight or a surprise he was planning, this was systematic exclusion from the most important event in our shared life. My next stop was the public library, where I spent 3 hours researching lottery procedures, winners' rights, and marriage law in Ohio. What I learned made my situation even more infuriating. In our state, lottery winnings acquired during marriage are considered marital property, meaning I was legally entitled to half of that $23 million regardless of whose name was on the ticket. Marcus hadn't just hidden money from me, he'd essentially stolen my legal inheritance. The research also revealed how carefully he'd covered his tracks. Winners have the option to claim prizes anonymously through trusts or business entities, which explained why I'd never seen any news coverage of our local lottery millionaire. Marcus had probably set up some kind of legal structure that kept his name out of the papers while he claimed the prize and began moving the money to accounts I couldn't access. I found myself admiring his thoroughness even as it enraged me. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to keep quiet about a windfall. This was a calculated campaign to exclude his wife from the benefits of their shared good fortune, executed with the kind of precision that suggested significant planning and probably professional help. From the library, I drove to the office of Patricia Wells, a divorce attorney whose advertisements I'd seen around town but never imagined I'd need. Her office was in a converted Victorian house near the courthouse, painted cheerful yellow with white trim that made it look more like someone's home than a place where marriages went to die. Patricia herself was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and eyes that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of marital betrayal. I explained my situation carefully, showing her copies of the bank statement and other documents I'd found. Patricia listened without judgment, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she understood exactly what I was dealing with. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me thoughtfully. "Kate," she said, using my first name in a way that somehow made me feel both more comfortable and more vulnerable. "What you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Money changes people, and large amounts of money can destroy relationships that seemed solid for decades. The good news is that Ohio law is very clear about marital property rights. The challenging news is that asserting those rights against a spouse who's actively trying to hide assets can be complicated and expensive." "How complicated?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Patricia's expression suggested this wouldn't be a simple matter of filing paperwork and waiting for a check. Your husband has had 8 months to move money around, create legal structures, and hide assets in ways that could take significant time and resources to unravel, she explained. If he's purchased property, made gifts to family members, or invested in businesses, recovering your share could require forensic accounting, private investigators, and potentially years of litigation. The process could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee we'd recover everything. What if I don't want a divorce? I asked, surprising myself with the question. What if I just want him to acknowledge what he's done and start including me in decisions about our money? Patricia's smile was gentle but realistic, the expression of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. That would be the ideal outcome, she said, but it requires your husband to cooperate voluntarily. Based on what you've told me about the systematic way he's hidden this fortune, including excluding you from property purchases and account access, I'm not optimistic about his willingness to suddenly become transparent. People who go to these lengths to hide assets usually aren't planning to share them willingly. She was right, of course. Marcus hadn't kept this secret accidentally or temporarily. He'd built an entire financial infrastructure designed to exclude me, probably with the help of lawyers and accountants who specialized in protecting assets from spouses. The question was whether I wanted to fight him through the courts or find another way to claim what was rightfully mine. I think I need some time to consider my options, I told Patricia, who nodded understandingly and handed me her business card along with a folder of information about Ohio divorce law and property rights. Take all the time you need, she said, but don't wait too long. Every day that passes gives him more opportunities to hide assets or claim they've been spent on legitimate expenses. If you decide to move forward, either with divorce proceedings or formal demands for financial disclosure, timing will be important. Driving home from Patricia's office, I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of my situation. 8 months ago, I'd been a happily married teacher whose biggest financial concern was whether we could afford to upgrade our cable package. Now I was contemplating legal warfare against the man I'd shared a bed with for 14 years, fighting for access to money I'd never dreamed of having. But underneath the overwhelm was a growing sense of determination. Marcus had made a choice to betray not just my trust but my legal rights as his wife. He'd decided unilaterally that I didn't deserve to know about or benefit from the biggest stroke of luck either of us had ever experienced. If he wanted to play games with millions of dollars and exclude me from the benefits, then he'd learn that his small-town teacher wife was more formidable than he'd given her credit for. That afternoon, I made my first strategic move. Using vacation days I'd been saving for our theoretical trip to the Grand Canyon, I called in sick for the rest of the week and booked a flight to Tampa, Florida. If Marcus and his mother were living some kind of double life with my money, I was going to see it for myself. The flight was my first since our honeymoon 15 years earlier, and everything about air travel had changed in ways that reminded me how small and sheltered my life had become. But as I settled into my window seat, watching Ohio disappear below me, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was doing something purely for myself, following my own instincts rather than deferring to Marcus's preferences and plans. I'd booked a rental car and a modest hotel room near Clearwater, using our credit card for everything. If Marcus noticed the charges, I'd explain them later. For now I was operating under the assumption that what was his was mine, even if he'd apparently decided the reverse wasn't true. The house at 847 Millionaires Row was even more impressive in person than it had been in the photographs. It sat on nearly 2 acres of manicured lawn, with palm trees and flowering bushes that probably cost more to maintain than most people earned in a year. The circular driveway could have accommodated a dozen cars, though only 2 were visible when I drove past slowly, trying to look like a lost tourist rather than a wife investigating her husband's secret life. One of the cars was a silver Mercedes that still had dealer plates, suggesting a recent purchase. The other was a practical Toyota that I recognized as the kind of vehicle Marcus's mother had always preferred. Both cars probably cost more than our house back in Ohio, casually parked in front of a mansion I'd never known existed. I spent nearly an hour driving through the neighborhood, getting a sense of the lifestyle Marcus had apparently bought for his mother. The houses were enormous, each one seemingly designed to impress visitors and intimidate neighbors. Swimming pools sparkled behind every property, and the few people I saw were clearly wealthy in ways that showed in their clothes, their cars, and their casual confidence. This was Dorothy's world now, funded entirely by money that legally belonged to both Marcus and me. She was living in luxury I could barely comprehend while I clipped coupons and worried about grocery bills. The injustice of it made me physically sick, but it also clarified my resolve. This wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the systematic way I'd been erased from my own life. My hotel room that night was modest but clean, with a view of the Gulf of Mexico that would have thrilled me under different circumstances. Instead, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine from the minibar, planning my next moves while watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded me why people paid millions of dollars to live in places like this. I'd brought my laptop, and I spent the evening researching Sunrise Assisted Living, the facility where Marcus had apparently moved his mother. Their website showed pictures of spacious apartments, gourmet dining rooms, and recreational facilities that looked more like a luxury resort than a retirement home. Monthly costs started at $3,500 and went up from there depending on the level of care and amenities desired. $3,500 a month. More than I earned as a teacher, and Marcus was paying it casually with money he'd won but never shared with his wife. I wondered if Dorothy knew where the money was coming from, or if Marcus had created some story about a business windfall or investment success. Knowing Dorothy, she'd probably never question sudden wealth as long as it benefited her. The next morning, I drove to Sunrise Assisted Living, a sprawling complex that looked more like a luxury hotel than any senior facility I'd ever seen. The lobbies were filled with fresh flowers, the residents were well-dressed and clearly well cared for, and everything about the place suggested serious money. I approached the reception desk with a story I'd rehearsed, claiming to be researching facilities for my own mother and asking for a tour. The marketing director who showed me around, Maria Santos, was enthusiastic about showcasing their amenities and their residents' quality of life. As we walked through the various common areas, I kept hoping to spot Dorothy, but the complex was enormous and most residents seemed to be out enjoying the Florida sunshine. "We have a wonderful community here," Maria explained as we toured the dining room, where residents were enjoying what looked like restaurant-quality meals. Many of our families find that their loved ones actually become more active and social after moving in with us. The opportunities for engagement are really endless. "That sounds wonderful," I said, taking mental notes about costs and waiting lists. "Do you have many residents from out of state? I'm wondering how difficult the transition might be for someone who's never lived in Florida." "Oh, absolutely," Maria replied. "We have residents from all over the country. Just last year we welcomed a lovely woman from Ohio, Dorothy Coleman. She's adjusted beautifully and has become one of our most active participants in community activities. It's always wonderful to see someone embrace a new chapter in their life so completely." My heart raced at the confirmation that Dorothy was indeed living here, funded by money Marcus had hidden from me. I managed to maintain my interested prospective family member expression, while inside I was calculating exactly how much my husband had spent to buy his mother this new life of luxury. "That's encouraging," I said carefully. "I'd hate for my mother to feel isolated or out of place." "It sounds like Mrs. Coleman made friends quickly." Maria's smile suggested she'd grown fond of Dorothy, which somehow made the whole situation even more infuriating. "Dorothy is wonderful," she said warmly. "Very generous with the other residents, always organizing social events and activities. She's mentioned that her son is so successful, able to provide her with this beautiful retirement. It's clear how much he loves her and wants her to be comfortable." The tour continued for another 30 minutes, but I barely absorbed the information Maria was sharing about amenities and services. All I could think about was Dorothy, living in luxury while describing Marcus as successful and generous, never mentioning that he was married to a woman who knew nothing about any of this. After leaving Sunrise, I drove back to the house on Millionaire's Row and parked across the street, partially hidden behind a landscaping truck that was working on a neighbor's property. I didn't have a specific plan, but I felt compelled to see more of this life Marcus had built without me. Around 2 in the afternoon, the front door of the house opened and Dorothy emerged, followed by a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and distinguished looking, probably in his 60s, wearing expensive casual clothes that suggested retirement spent playing golf at exclusive country clubs. Dorothy looked 15 years younger than when I'd last seen her, her hair professionally styled and her outfit clearly expensive. They got into the Mercedes and drove away, probably heading out for lunch or shopping or whatever wealthy retirees did with their endless free time. I sat in my rental car, staring at the house where my mother-in-law was living a life I'd never been invited to share, funded by money that was legally mine. The most painful part wasn't even the money, though that certainly stung. It was the complete exclusion, the way Marcus had systematically removed me from the most important development in our lives. He'd won the lottery and immediately decided that this stroke of luck belonged to him and his mother, not to his wife of 14 years. I'd been erased from their celebration, their planning, their joy. That evening, back in my hotel room, I called Marcus on his cell phone. It was a calculated risk, since he might wonder why I sounded like I was calling long distance, but I needed to test his reaction to some carefully chosen questions. "Hey beautiful," he answered, his voice carrying the same warmth it always did. "How was your day? Miss you." The casual affection that had once made me feel secure now felt like mockery, like he was performing the role of loving husband while living a completely different reality. "I miss you too," I said, injecting the right amount of longing into my voice. "How's your mom doing? You mentioned she seemed stressed the last time you talked to her." It was a fishing expedition, trying to see if he'd volunteer any information about Dorothy's current situation. There was a brief pause before Marcus answered, and I could almost hear him calculating how much truth to include in his response. "She's actually doing much better," he said finally. "I think she's been getting out more, staying active. You know how she gets when she doesn't have enough to keep her busy." "That's good to hear," I replied. "Maybe we should plan a visit soon. It's been too long since I've seen her." Another test, wondering if he'd panic at the suggestion of me discovering Dorothy's new lifestyle. "Yeah, maybe," Marcus said, but his tone had shifted to something less enthusiastic. "She's been talking about maybe taking some trips though, so timing might be tricky. I'll ask her about her schedule and let you know." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but every word felt like performance now. Marcus asking about my day, sharing mundane details about work, expressing love and affection for the wife he was systematically betraying. I wondered how he'd managed to maintain this charade for 8 months, how he compartmentalized his guilt enough to kiss me goodnight, while spending my inheritance on his mother's luxury retirement. After hanging up, I sat on my hotel balcony again, watching boats move across the water and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Marcus hadn't just hidden a lottery win, he'd used that money to create an entirely separate life that revolved around making his mother happy while keeping his wife in artificial poverty. Every day I worried about our budget. Every time I chose generic groceries or postponed necessary purchases, I was subsidizing the fiction that we were struggling while he funded Dorothy's mansion and luxury lifestyle. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully planned, that I almost had to admire its thoroughness. Marcus had thought of everything: secret accounts, anonymous lottery claims, property purchases in his mother's name, cover stories about Dorothy's improved situation. The only thing he hadn't planned for was his wife's determination to uncover the truth once she stumbled onto his secret. That night, I made a series of phone calls from my hotel room. I called Patricia Wells and arranged a meeting for the following week to discuss my legal options in detail. I called a private investigator, whose name I'd found online, and scheduled a consultation to discuss asset searches and documentation gathering. Most importantly, I called my sister Jenny and asked if I could use her address for some mail deliveries, explaining that I was involved in a sensitive situation that required discretion. The next morning, before flying back to Ohio, I drove past the house on Millionaire's Row one more time. The Mercedes was gone, but Dorothy's Toyota was still there, and I could see movement behind the large windows that suggested someone was home. For a moment, I considered walking up to the front door and confronting her directly, demanding to know how she could accept luxury paid for with money that rightfully belonged to her son's wife, but something held me back. Maybe it was strategy, recognizing that surprise was my most valuable weapon right now. Maybe it was uncertainty about how much Dorothy actually knew about the source of her new wealth. Or maybe it was the recognition that this confrontation, when it came, needed to be perfectly planned and executed to have maximum impact. As I drove to the airport, I felt transformed in ways that went beyond just learning my husband's secrets. 3 days ago, I'd been a naive wife who trusted completely and questioned nothing. Now I was someone who could lie convincingly to bank officers, research legal strategies, travel across the country to gather intelligence, and plan complex responses to betrayal. Marcus had inadvertently created exactly the kind of opponent he should have feared most, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The flight home gave me time to organize my thoughts and plan my next moves. I would return to my normal routine, teaching my students and maintaining the pretense of our ordinary marriage while secretly building a case that would give me maximum leverage when I was ready to act. Marcus thought he'd outmaneuvered me completely, had created a perfect system for excluding me from the benefits of our shared good fortune. He was about to learn that his small-town teacher wife was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. As Ohio came into view below me, I smiled for the first time in days. Marcus had started a game he didn't know I was playing. Now it was time to show him exactly what happened when you underestimated the wrong woman. 2 weeks after returning from Florida, I was ready to execute the plan that would change everything. I'd spent those weeks perfecting my performance as the unsuspecting wife, while secretly preparing for war. Marcus had no idea that his careful world of lies was about to collapse around him. The private investigator I'd hired, Thomas Rivera, had exceeded my expectations. Within days, he'd uncovered financial records, traced money transfers, and documented a pattern of deception that went far beyond what I'd initially discovered. Marcus had been even busier than I'd realized, establishing shell companies, making strategic purchases, and systematically moving assets in ways designed to hide them from discovery. The lottery ticket had been worth exactly $23.4 million, as I'd suspected. But Marcus had been creative with the money, purchasing the Florida house outright, investing in several business ventures, and even buying a yacht that was apparently docked somewhere near Miami. The man who complained about our grocery bills had spent more on a boat than most people earned in their entire careers. Most importantly, Thomas had documented everything in ways that would hold up in court. Bank records, property deeds, business registrations, even photographs of Marcus visiting his various investments during what I'd thought were work trips. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Patricia Wells had been equally thorough in preparing the legal groundwork. Ohio law was crystal clear about lottery winnings being marital property, and Marcus's attempts to hide assets actually worked in my favor by establishing intent to defraud. We had grounds for not just a divorce settlement, but criminal charges if I chose to pursue them. The morning I chose for my confrontation was deliberately symbolic. It was exactly 8 months from the day Marcus had won the lottery, though he had no way of knowing I'd calculated that timing. He'd been working his usual night shift and came home tired but cheerful, expecting another normal morning with his oblivious wife. I was waiting for him in the kitchen with coffee already made, and a manila folder sitting beside his usual place at the table. When he walked in, still in his work clothes and smelling of the automotive plant, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment everything would change, and I was ready. "Morning beautiful," he said, moving to kiss my cheek as always. I let him, studying his face, for what I knew would be the last time I'd see him as the man I'd thought I married. "Coffee smells good. Long night at the factory. Sit down, Marcus," I said quietly, gesturing toward the folder. "We need to talk about your lottery win." The change in his expression was instantaneous and complete. The color drained from his face, his hand froze halfway to the coffee pot, and for several seconds he didn't breathe. Then he turned to look at me with eyes I'd never seen before, calculating and afraid in equal measure. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sarah, if someone's been telling you stories about me winning money, they're lying. You know we don't have that kind of luck." I opened the folder and pulled out the first photograph Thomas had taken, a clear shot of Marcus entering the lottery office downtown 8 months earlier. Then another of him at the bank where he'd opened the secret accounts. Then pictures of the house in Florida, the yacht, the Mercedes, all purchased with money he'd claimed didn't exist. $23.4 million, I said calmly. One on March 15th with a ticket you bought at Henderson's gas station on your way home from work. You claimed it anonymously through something called the Coleman Family Trust, which you established without telling your wife that she was supposedly part of this family. Marcus sank into his chair heavily, staring at the photographs as if they might disappear if he looked hard enough. The silence stretched between us while I watched him realize that his carefully constructed deception had been completely exposed. "How did you find out?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" I replied. "The question is why you decided to steal from me." "Because that's what this is, Marcus. You stole my legal share of the biggest windfall either of us will ever see, and you used it to fund a luxury lifestyle for your mother while keeping me in artificial poverty." He looked up then and I saw something I'd never seen in his face before during our 14 years together. Genuine fear, not of physical harm but of consequences he'd never planned for. His small-town teacher wife had just proven she was far more formidable than he'd believed possible. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," he said weakly. "I was going to tell you eventually. I just needed time to figure out how to handle everything properly. The money, the taxes, the planning. It's complicated, Sarah, more complicated than you understand." I laughed, a sound without warmth or humor. "Complicated? You mean like buying an $800,000 house for your mother without mentioning it to your wife? Like spending $150,000 on a yacht while I clip coupons? Like moving Dorothy into a luxury retirement home that costs more per month than I earn teaching?" Marcus winced at each revelation, realizing how thoroughly I'd investigated his secret life. "You went to Florida," he said, "and it wasn't a question." "I went to Florida," I confirmed. "I saw the house, Marcus. I toured Dorothy's assisted living palace. I met with bankers and lawyers and private investigators. While you were busy hiding millions from me, I was busy learning exactly what you'd stolen and how to get it back." The fear in his eyes deepened as he began to understand the scope of what I'd discovered, and the implications of being caught so completely. "This isn't just about the money, Sarah. There are tax implications, legal structures, business investments. If you start making waves, it could mess up everything I've worked to build." "Everything you've worked to build," I repeated. "With my money, money that legally belongs to both of us, but that you decided I wasn't worthy of knowing about." I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, needing distance from him while I delivered the ultimatum I'd been practicing. "Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. You have exactly 24 hours to transfer half of everything to accounts in my name. The Florida house, the yacht, the business investments, the remaining cash, all of it. 50% goes to me immediately, along with full documentation of every asset and every expenditure since you won that lottery." He was shaking his head before I finished speaking. "Sarah, you don't understand the complexity of unwinding these financial arrangements. It could take months, maybe years, to restructure everything properly, and some of the investments are locked up in ways that make immediate access impossible. Then you should have thought of that before you decided to exclude your wife from the most important financial event in our marriage," I replied, coldly. 24 hours, Marcus, or I file for divorce and press criminal charges for financial fraud. Patricia Wells assures me that Ohio courts don't look kindly on spouses who hide marital assets this systematically. The mention of a lawyer's name made him realize this wasn't an emotional outburst, but a carefully planned confrontation. "You've really thought this through," he said, and there was something like admiration in his voice despite the fear. "I've had plenty of time to think while you were busy spending our fortune without me," I said. "I've also had time to document every lie you've told, every secret account you've opened, every purchase you've made with money that belongs to both of us. The evidence is overwhelming, Marcus. Your only choice now is whether you want to handle this privately or let the courts sort it out publicly." "What about us?" he asked quietly. "What about our marriage? 14 years, Sarah, that has to count for something." "It counted for nothing when you decided to exclude me from $23 million, I replied. "It counted for nothing when you moved your mother into a mansion while I worried about grocery bills. It counted for nothing when you bought yourself a yacht while I postponed dental work because the copay seemed too expensive." I returned to the table and sat across from him, studying the face I'd once loved and now barely recognized. The man I'd married wouldn't have been capable of this level of deception and betrayal. Either he'd changed completely, or I'd never really known him at all. You have until tomorrow morning, I continued. Full financial disclosure, immediate transfer of 50% of all assets, and a written agreement about how we handle everything going forward. Or I walk away with the best divorce attorney in the state, and enough evidence to ensure I get everything I'm entitled to plus damages for your fraudulent concealment. Marcus stared at the photographs scattered on our kitchen table, probably calculating whether he could find some way to minimize the damage or maintain control of the situation. I could almost see him running through options, trying to find an angle that would let him keep the upper hand he'd maintained through months of systematic lies. "What if I agree to your terms?" he asked finally. "What happens to us then? Do we try to rebuild our marriage, or is this just about the money?" I considered his question seriously, though I suspected I already knew my answer. "For 8 months, you looked me in the eye every morning and evening while living a completely different life. You watched me worry about expenses while you had access to more money than we could spend in 3 lifetimes. You funded your mother's luxury retirement while keeping your wife in artificial poverty. Do you really think there's a way back from that level of betrayal?" He didn't answer immediately, which told me he understood the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. Trust, once broken this completely, doesn't heal easily or quickly. A marriage based on lies this systematic might not be salvageable no matter how much money was involved. "I need time to make the financial arrangements," he said, eventually. "Some of these assets can't be moved quickly without penalties or legal complications. Give me a week, maybe 2, to handle everything properly." 24 hours, I repeated firmly. "You had 8 months to make these arrangements in secret, Marcus. You can figure out how to reverse them in 1 day. Or you can explain to a judge why you thought it was acceptable to steal from your wife." The next 24 hours passed slowly. Marcus made phone calls, met with lawyers and accountants, and generally scrambled to undo the financial structures he'd created to exclude me. I went to work as usual, teaching my 4th graders about fractions and maintaining the facade of normalcy while my marriage imploded in carefully planned stages. When I arrived home the next evening, I found Marcus sitting at our kitchen table with neat stacks of paperwork arranged in front of him. Bank routing numbers, account information, property transfer documents, investment statements. The complete financial picture of our secret fortune, finally laid out where his wife could see it. The numbers were staggering even when I'd thought I was prepared for them. After 8 months of spending, there was still over $15 million in various accounts and investments. The Florida house was worth nearly $1 million now due to appreciation. The yacht had been purchased for $150,000, but was apparently worth more after some customization Marcus had arranged. Even the business investments he'd made were performing well, generating returns that increased our net worth monthly. "I've transferred everything as you requested," he said quietly. 50% of all assets are now in accounts bearing your name only. You have complete control over your portion, no restrictions or limitations. He slid a folder across the table. "These are all your account numbers, passwords, contact information for the financial advisors handling your investments." I opened the folder and reviewed documents that represented more wealth than I'd dreamed of possessing. My share of the lottery win came to nearly $12 million, not counting the ongoing returns from Marcus's investment choices. I was suddenly, impossibly, incredibly rich. "Thank you," I said, closing the folder carefully. It was strange to thank my husband for returning money he'd stolen from me, but the gesture felt important somehow. "Now we need to discuss what happens next." Marcus looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by the stress of managing his deception and then having it completely exposed. "Do you want a divorce?" he asked directly. I considered the question that had been haunting me since I'd first discovered his secret. The betrayal was complete and devastating, but the man sitting across from me was still the person I'd shared 14 years of my life with. Could that history be worth preserving, or was it built on foundations too damaged to support a future together? "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "What I know is that I can't live with someone who could lie to me this systematically for this long. I can't trust someone who could watch me worry about money while secretly managing millions. I need time to figure out whether there's anything left of our marriage that's worth saving. Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. What do you want me to do? Move out, give you space, try to earn back your trust somehow. I want you to tell me why, I said. Not the complicated explanations about taxes and legal structures and financial planning. The real reason you decided to exclude your wife from the biggest moment of our lives. The real reason you chose your mother over our marriage. He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I was scared, he said. Scared that much money would change everything between us. Scared that you'd want things I couldn't provide even with millions of dollars. Scared that I'd lose you to a world I didn't understand. The irony of his confession wasn't lost on me. He'd been so afraid of losing me to wealth, that he'd chosen to lose me to lies instead. By trying to control how our fortune affected our relationship, he'd destroyed the relationship entirely. So you decided to make those choices for both of us, I said. Without asking what I wanted or how I felt about sudden wealth. You decided I couldn't handle being rich, so you'd manage everything yourself and keep me poor. I wanted to protect what we had, he said desperately. Our simple life, our routines, our happiness. I thought if I could handle the money separately, we could keep our marriage exactly the same as it always was. But it wasn't the same, Marcus. You changed completely. You became someone who could lie to my face every single day while living an entirely different reality. You became someone who could watch his wife struggle with bills while secretly owning a yacht. That's not protection, that's betrayal. The conversation continued late into the night, but we both knew it was essentially over. The damage was too complete, the betrayal too systematic, the lies too fundamental to the relationship we'd thought we were building together. Marcus had tried to preserve our marriage by excluding me from our good fortune, and in doing so, he'd destroyed everything he'd been trying to protect. 3 months later, I was living alone in a beautiful new house I'd purchased with my lottery winnings, teaching at a private school that appreciated both my experience and my generous donations to their scholarship fund. Marcus and I were legally separated, working toward what would probably become an amicable divorce, once we'd both adjusted to our new realities. The money had indeed changed everything, just not in the ways Marcus had feared. I'd discovered strengths I'd never known I possessed, developed confidence I'd never felt before, and learned that I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me had ultimately freed me to become someone I'd never had the courage to be. Marcus still lived in our old house, managing his portion of the fortune with the same secretive care he'd always employed. We spoke occasionally about practical matters, but the easy intimacy of 14 years was gone forever, replaced by the careful politeness of two people who'd once loved each other, but could no longer trust what that love meant. Dorothy still lived in her Florida mansion, though I'd heard through mutual friends that she'd grown uncomfortable with the luxury once she learned how it had been funded. The knowledge that her son had stolen from his wife to pay for her retirement had apparently dimmed some of the enjoyment she'd found in her new lifestyle. As for me, I was learning what it meant to live without secrets, without lies, without the artificial limitations that had defined my existence for so long. The lottery win had given me financial freedom, but discovering Marcus's betrayal had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, and smart enough to fight for what was rightfully mine. The woman who'd discovered that bank statement in her garage 8 months earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous person in any relationship is the one who believes they're powerless. Marcus had learned that lesson too late, and it had cost him everything he'd tried so desperately to protect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.